The second session of the 2020 Ohio Beef Cow-Calf Workshop was hosted by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on February 13th at Claylick Run Farm near Newark, Ohio. During the second session, Dean Kreager, OSU Extension Educator in Licking County, discussed the importance of following proper technique when handling and thawing semen, and also shared some graphic examples of what happens when frozen semen is mishandled between the time it leaves the tank and until it's deposited in the cow. This is Dean's presentation.
We'll kind of follow up. Dr. Anderson had a great talk for us this morning. The importance of synchronizing cows, even if you're using bulls with them, and what we can do with that. Some of us are using artificial insemination, some aren't. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of using the proper techniques with thawing semen and handling semen. Sometimes we hear about it and it doesn't set in. So I'm going to try to cover some things. I'm not going to take too much time, but we're going to talk about cryopreservation and what that means, the principles of it, just to give you kind of a little understanding on what's going on with those frozen samples. The importance of the temperatures, what's that really mean? We'll go through a little bit on how you should be thawing it, how you should be loading it, and a little bit more on tank management at the end. I'm starting off with this just to give you a basic idea of what's going on in the cells so that you know why all this cryopreservation stuff is important. So with cryopreservation, really there's two types of cryopreservation that we use to freeze cells. One of them is called vitrification. That's used some with embryos. It's a new technique. It flash freezes things so that they freeze instantly and you don't get ice crystals to form in them. But that's not how semen's frozen, so we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about slow freezing. And slow freezing is what we have to do in order to get these cells to survive. When something freezes, what usually happens? When things get cold, they normally shrink down. They get turned to a solid state. What happens with water? Water is different. Water, when it freezes, it expands. Just like that container of ice in your freezer, those ice cubes expand. So what do you think happens when this is inside cells? What are cells made of? They're about 80% water, 70 to 80% water. So if we just try to freeze those cells, that water inside there is going to form ice crystals. They're going to expand, and what's it going to do? It's going to kill the cell. So we have to do things to make it so that those cells can survive. And this is just quick kind of showing if you could, these are just cells. If you envision a tail on there, it would be like a sperm cell. So we've got the cell. We add a cryoprotectant around there. The cryoprotectant helps draw the water out of the cell, basically dehydrates it. We have to hit a special point with certain temperatures. If we dehydrate it too fast, it draws out too much water too quick. And these cryoprotectants also can be toxic and it can kill the cells. If we do it too slow, and that's what I meant, if we do it too slow, it can be toxic to the cells and draw too much water out and kill them. If we do it too fast, we don't get enough water drawn out. It forms ice crystals in the cell, and they aren't able to survive. All right. So I mentioned cryoprotectants. The cryoprotectants are just chemicals, basically, that are able to, the cells can survive being around them. Most of them are at least somewhat toxic, so we have to limit exposure to them. The other component that's in that semen when they freeze it are what they call extenders. And these extenders can have a wide variety of things. So what semen, the semen you buy from one organization, say Select Sires, and what you buy from maybe ABS or someone else, may be completely different on what's inside there. They may have egg yolk. A lot of the extenders originally had biological components such as egg yolk and milk. Both of these work well. In fact, I was just out at Select Sires. When I used to work there, we did everything in egg yolk except the stuff that I did. I did stuff in milk. It was for export, and the disease testing on it was easier when it came from milk than from eggs because the eggs had to go through specific testing and pathogens in order to export semen. They also have, sometimes you may buy semen that'll be clear in the straws. There are other compounds like this tris base that may make it clear. I tell you all these things because these things affect the way that you thaw the sperm. Some things you can get away with, some you can't. We'll get into that a little bit. So frozen is frozen, right? Well, I put this up here because when I was doing research on semen, I was in grad school at Ohio State, working out at Select Sires, and we were supplying semen for a research project at Ohio State. I just kind of assumed that if somebody is asking for the semen, they knew how to handle it. I thought at least, once I got out there to ask the question, okay, so what are you going to do with this once I give it to you? Well, they're going to take it home and they're going to put it in the freezer back at the lab. I knew they didn't really have nitrogen storage, but they were planning on thinking that they could take it since it was already frozen and put it just in a freezer. Well, that doesn't work. And so we can't assume anything. Some people just don't understand. So when it comes to the temperatures, anybody know what the temperature of liquid nitrogen is? Liquid nitrogen is what we have in the nitrogen tanks that we're storing the semen. Liquid nitrogen is 320 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. So it's pretty cold. I have up here critical temperature. All right, so we know that the sperm can be frozen and you can keep dropping that temperature down, 320 degrees, they're fine. What's the warmest that they can be and maintain their viability? This one is a little bit up in the air. Different people have different things published. About the warmest thing that I found is some research that was done saying negative 112 degrees. There's other places that tell you the temperature is much colder than that they can still suffer damage, even when they're at about negative 160 to 180 degrees. So I'm telling you this because when you have that semen in the tank and you're trying to look for straws, it's really important that you aren't warming those cells up. And it doesn't take long to warm them. Just by comparison, dry ice. People used to actually ship semen in dry ice. It's negative 109 degrees Fahrenheit. It's right around this critical temperature. They found that usually you could ship it on dry ice, but you had a lot of variation in quality once it arrived. So nobody's doing that anymore. When we look at the nitrogen tank, there's one sitting up here. If you pop the cap on there and you look down inside, and you can look right on the cork, and you can see a frost line. There's a matching frost line on the inside of the tank. Typically, that frost line is the point that you need to keep those straws below that to keep that temperature down under that negative 112 degrees. So this is a breakdown of some temperatures. And you can see that from the top of the tank until you get down to the bottom of that neck, there's a lot of fluctuation. So if you pull that canister all the way up to the top and you're trying to wipe off straws and figure out what's what, you're warming those straws. Every time you warm them, you do damage to them. It doesn't repair itself when it goes back down and you refreeze it. It already has damage done. The next time you do the same thing, you're going to damage them even further. The nitrogen tanks, these are made, if you had a cutaway, you can see there's a container inside of this outer shell. It has a vacuum around it, and that vacuum is what allows it to hold that liquid nitrogen. Some of these tanks can go for up to 6 months without being filled. Usually you're on a quicker rotation than that. But they can hold nitrogen, liquid nitrogen, at a long time. All right. One other thing I wanted to say about those is they seem pretty tough, and they are pretty tough, but you have to be careful with them when you're handling them because it is like a vacuum container. And that whole inner part of it is just attached with the neck up in there. There's some material that kind of helps hold it in place, but jarring that thing around, you can cause that neck to break loose on the inside. As soon as that happens, you lose the vacuum. When the vacuum goes out, that tank goes bad in a hurry. You can have one go bad within a day if that vacuum's gone. I'll skip ahead to that. I was going to, you have things like this. You can use something else, but these sticks are made specifically for measuring nitrogen. Really, not too many people do it, but you should. You should go into your tank, I would say at least once a week. You just pull it out, drop this down to the bottom of the tank, give it a couple seconds. You'll hear it quit sizzling. You can pull it out, blow on it a little, and you can see exactly how much nitrogen's in there. You should keep a log, keep a notebook. You can see how fast it's dropping. It should be dropping at a controlled rate. You know, if you hit a point where it's only been dropping an inch every 2 weeks and all of a sudden it's dropped 4 inches and you haven't had that take out, taken a whole bunch of semen out, you better be careful, and you might be checking that every day to make sure that it hasn't lost vacuum. Another thing to look for on them is if you start seeing frost form around the top or around the bottom, it's a sign that it's lost vacuum and it's going bad. What most people do is work with one of the breeding companies. Select Sires, for instance, has the truck that goes around and they'll fill tanks for you on a routine basis. If you're purchasing semen from one of them, they'll fill your tank. If you're not purchasing semen, it gets a little trickier. Sometimes you can get them. It would probably cost you more to get it filled. I have heard that you can take them to some of the gas companies, and they may have the liquid nitrogen available to top off your tanks there. All right, so when we start to talk about thawing the samples, we want to make sure that's done all correctly. We talked about temperature. One of the things, and a lot of people don't use them, but it is important to use, are these tweezers. They make these specially for taking straws out of the tank. They have a groove in them that'll fit right around the straw. You can cool these down, hold them down in the neck of the tank for a little bit, and then when you pull that cane up, you can just reach down in there. You can reach down farther so you don't have to pull the semen up as high and pull the straw out. There's different devices you can use for thawing. Here's just a couple of them. They have these nice ones that can plug into an outlet. They can plug into a car. They can even, some of them are battery recharged. They are preset at a certain temperature, about the 95-degree temperature that you want. You can use a thermos. They make these special for thawing semen. You can use another one as long as you have a thermometer to make sure that, like ones like this, have a spot in there. You drop the straw in there, and it's got the thermometer. You just need to make sure that your temperature is at about 95 degrees. Can't fluctuate very much. A degree or two is okay, but if you start getting down under 90 or you get over about 98, you'll start damaging the cells. No, once you've thawed it, it's not going to be good if you refreeze it. Yeah. All right. So, let's see. Back on the temperature stuff for a little bit. All right. So I talked about negative 112 degrees being a critical point on the sperm. Once it gets above that, you've got a problem. This is some studies they did. This was clear back in 1976. And I'm bringing some of this up. I'll actually start this around. If you guys haven't seen the mini straw, the quarter cc straws, if you're buying sex semen, it comes in the quarter cc straws. And then there's a half cc straw in here too, just so you can see by comparison. But the temperature fluctuation, you can see on here, if you're pulling that up into the neck or you're lifting it out to check it, this is in minutes. So at a quarter of a minute, 15 seconds on a quarter cc straw, you've already warmed that up enough that you're doing damage to it. On a half cc straw, you may get by for close to 30 seconds before you do damage, but I wouldn't want to risk it. And like I said, some of that stuff's cumulative. If you do it once, okay. If you have to do it a second time, you're basically just adding damage to what was already done. So if you have a tank and you don't have your canes labeled real well and you're having to always pull up and see what was on the straw, I've seen it many times. You use your thumb, you use your finger, you wipe off the side of the straw to see what the label says because it's kind of frosted. You do a lot of damage to that. And as I'm passing those around, just mentioning the difference between the quarter cc and the half cc straws. There are some places that are switching and processing a lot of semen in quarter cc straws and the small ones. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. The advantage with the quarter cc straw is that the rate, when you're freezing that semen, you can control the rate. You can get a more even freeze because it's a smaller cylinder shape, so you have less, the number of cells that are on the interior of it that aren't cooling as quick or less, so you get a more even cooling rate than you do on a half cc straw. And the thawing rate works in reverse. You can get a more even thawing rate with the quarters. The problem you run into is if you aren't using all the proper techniques, you can do more damage to those quicker. As far as when you're buying semen, it really makes no difference. Some people think it's half the size, it's got half the semen. Well, it doesn't have half the semen, it has the same amount. They just put it in more concentrated. Now, when we talk the sex semen, then you do have less cells in there. I think, are they at 4 million now? And when you're buying regular semen, you're usually talking, for beef bulls, 25 million most of the time in one straw. They may go down to about 15 million, but most of the time they're around 25. A young bull that they don't know anything on, there may be 35 million in that straw until they learn about the fertility on them. So there are a lot more cells. Having the more cells doesn't necessarily mean your pregnancy rate's going to be higher because you need a certain amount in order to get that cow pregnant, but you don't necessarily mean they kind of overdose them just to be sure. All right, so I did a couple of experiments here. I used this equipment I had over here. Select Sires donated some semen to me. They didn't have any of this stuff on video when I talked to them for me to get. If you want to go ahead and kill the lights, it'll be easier to see, I think. What I did, they provided semen on, I think the bull was called Broad Range, a Simmental bull. This semen didn't pass their quality control checks. It had too many abnormal cells in it. The motility is reasonable. It's not great. But I did a standard thaw on it, and then I took a straw that I did like I had mentioned. I pulled it up. I spent just a second or two wiping off the side, read the label, put it down in, left it in about 30 seconds, did it. Again, 3 different times. All right. So this is the type of motility that the standard thaw had. You can see quite a few cells moving in there. This sample on the right, that's the one that I had been exposed. You still have cells moving in there, but there's a whole lot less moving. And that was just with 3 times of just wiping that label, dropping it back in. So we'll hit again. Up. The second thing is, this was the standard thaw again. And then I did what they call a shirt pocket thaw. There's some companies that recommend this with their samples. They tell you just put it in the pocket of your shirt, thaw it out while you're breeding cows. I mentioned earlier how we have different cryopreservation media. Some of it's in milk. If you have samples that are frozen in milk, you might be able to get away doing a shirt pocket thaw. But if you have a sample that's frozen in this egg yolk citrate, you're going to really hurt it. So, and a lot of samples that people get are frozen in the egg yolk citrate. So, let's see. You can see most of this movement you're seeing is just drifting on the slide. You can see a little bit of wiggling on the sperm. The ones that are moving really slow. There's that much difference just based on the method of your thawing. You can go ahead and turn the lights back on. When it comes to loading the samples, we've got different options now. And I showed you the different straws we have. There's quarter cc's, half cc straws. They have different guns that are designed for each of those. But they also have universal guns. So they have different types. They've got the old-fashioned ones that have been around forever that have the donut on there. You put a sheath on the rod. And the straws inside of here. I'll go over that in just a second. But the difference is, like this type doesn't use a donut, and this type doesn't use a donut. The donuts work good, but the problem is they're loose, and they're pretty easy to lose. And when you lose one, it makes it really difficult to get the cow bred because you're trying to hold that sheath on there at the same time you're trying to breed the cow. These other ones, like this one, this is one I purchased a couple years ago and I really like. It's got a clip on there so that when you put the sheath on there, it just pops in and it's locked on. You don't have the donut to mess with. You want to take it off, there's just a little release and it pulls right off. This is a rod that is universal for both the half cc straws and quarter cc straws. They make the other types of rods, like the one with the donut. They make ones of those that are universal for quarter cc and half. And then the other, I don't have an example of one. I think David has one here probably, is the twist lock. They're basically the same thing. It's just another version. You just push the sheath on and you twist it and it locks in place so that you don't have that donut part to worry about. And they make those in both quarter and half cc's and universal. When you go to load your straw semen, we talked just quickly about thawing it. You pull it out of the tank. Make sure that you're using tweezers. You keep it down in the liquid nitrogen, down below the frost level in your tank. You pull it out. You drop it in. You keep your thawing bath right next to your tank. Drop it in. Let it thaw for at least 45 seconds. Going longer doesn't hurt. Going shorter does hurt. If you can have it in there for 10 minutes if you have to. You don't really want to thaw more samples than you need because your water bath temperature could drop, something like that. All right. Yeah, and this one that David brought out is just like the other. The one thing with the sheaths is the twist lock, they don't have a split sheath, so you have a specially designed one that locks into there. And they're usually blue. If you have green sheaths like these, they have a split on them, and on those you can use those. You can use either of them on this universal gun that I have, or you can use the split ones on the ones with the donuts. All right, so you thaw your straw, and then once it's thawed, you wipe it off completely. Pull the plunger back so that when you go to drop the straw in there, you're not pushing semen out because that plunger is the metal rod, and if you have it partway down and you push the straw down on it, you can push the semen right out. So you got to make sure it's back. You also want to make sure that your gun is warm before you load it. Having it inside your shirt, if you have like a t-shirt under another shirt, that usually works good. Even just holding it in your hand. You want to keep everything as sanitary as you can, so if you have dirty hands, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But it is important to be warm. This is a metal housing. These straws are small, and if you do everything right, thawing your semen at the right temperature, and you drop it into a gun that's been sitting at freezing temperatures, that semen temperature is going to drop quick, and when it does that, it does damage to the cells.
Why is it so important to have that straw dry off before you load it?
Water is extremely detrimental to sperm. If you have sperm in a container, 1 drop of water in there will kill it almost instantly. It changes, well, I won't go into the science behind it, but it doesn't, not necessarily the pH, but it changes the osmolarity. and the osmolarity basically will cause that sperm to swell up. It sucks fluid in because the osmolarity is different, and it'll rupture the membranes, and it'll kill them. So it doesn't take much. So that's why it's really important, because even when you go to load it in here, a drop on there can stay inside in between the sheath and the gun. It may pull up right at the end where you're pushing all the semen out through that sheath, and it takes that water bubble out with it, and your chances of getting that cow pregnant are not good. Just a little bit on nitrogen tank care. I already talked quick about making sure you're keeping track of the level in there. You want to keep them at least reasonably clean. I know that a lot of times they get taken out into the barn. Getting manure on the tank is probably going to happen at times, but you got to remember to keep those cleaned off. What does manure tend to do to metal when it gets on there? It corrodes it. And anything that can corrode even a pinhole through one of these tanks, it takes the vacuum away. Check the cork. The cork I pulled out. One of the things sometimes you'll see, and I've seen it before, is these may break off. If you see them getting loose and wobbly, it might be a good time to get a new one, because if it breaks off and falls down into the tank, you can usually get them out, but sometimes it's pretty tricky. If you're hauling the tank, like I mentioned, it is fragile. I mean, it can take a pretty good beating, but every time you're taking it and jostling it around, it's always a chance for failure on it. By law, you're not allowed to haul these like on the seat in your truck. They have to be hauled outside of the cab legally. I mean, who does that? But they should be in the back of the truck and strapped in. Oh, and I was going to mention, why do you think it is that they have just a loose cork? They don't have something on here that screws on? If you had something that screwed on there, you'd have a bomb, because that thing is always venting off gas. And so that nitrogen's venting off, and that cork allows the nitrogen to come off. That's also the reason you don't have that tank in your car. If you had it in there for 2 days, and then you go to get in your car, that tank's been venting off nitrogen the whole time. You can't smell nitrogen when you get in there, but if you get in an area that's been filled with nitrogen, it can kill you. There's been people that have died going into rooms. I actually had an experience when I worked at Select Sires. We had a crack in the line that filled tanks in the area where I worked. And I walked in, and I realized that I saw it dripping. And by the time I got out, I was borderline passing out. I mean, I was dizzy. So it will get you quick. And there were some people that died a couple years ago because they went into a room where there was a liquid nitrogen leak. One of the interesting things, I've taken nitrogen out to schools and done experiments with kids and stuff, and it's always fun to show how much that little bit of nitrogen can expand into the air. Take a 20-ounce pop bottle, and I'll just put in ½ inch of nitrogen, stretch a balloon over that. I'll set it off on a table back behind me. It's hard to keep their attention because they're sitting there watching that balloon get bigger and bigger. I did learn that you should let the teachers in the other rooms know that you're doing this, and it's not an active shooter in the building, because when that thing explodes, it makes a bang. Another thing with these tanks, what happens on top of concrete? If you have things, you set feed bags directly down on it, you get moisture that wicks through concrete. You have a nitrogen tank, it may feel like it's room temperature. It may be a couple degrees colder. I mean, you're storing liquid nitrogen in there. It's going to have a tendency to form condensation underneath it, and then you're trapping moisture between your tank and the floor. There also are some chemicals in the salts and concrete that can have a reaction, so you should always store your tanks on top of a wooden platform. And then we'll finish up here. What we want to do is we want to maximize fertility. We want to follow these principles. Some of the things that we need to keep in mind are avoiding temperature changes. We want to avoid direct sunlight. I didn't talk about this one much, but if you're breeding cows out and you're not under a roof, you're out in an open area, the sun's shining down, you should have something to protect your samples from the sun shining onto them. UV light kills sperm. As quick as we're doing it, if you don't have that straw laying out, you're probably okay, but it's a good thing to have a little bit of shade on top of it. Al brought up about the water. The water is definitely something we need to avoid getting around the sperm. Using sanitary procedures. I didn't get into any of the details of actually breeding the cow, but once you get everything loaded, what's the next thing that can hold you up? If you had the cow in heat, you do all the procedures right. If you go and you breed a cow and you don't clean her off well and you drag manure inside of her, you're likely to cause enough of an immune response to that foreign material that it's going to reduce your pregnancy rates.